The Gathering Storm, 5 battles that shaped America. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor erupted in a symphony of fire. The first shell arced across the sky like a meteor, its burning fuse tracing a path toward Fort Sumter and toward a new American destiny. That single projectile would trigger 4 years of combat that nearly tore our nation apart. But within that tapestry of tragedy and triumph, 5 battles would rise above all others, 5 singular days when the fate of the United States hung by a thread. We think we know this story. Brother against brother, blue versus gray, north against south. But to truly understand how America survived its trial by fire, we must zero in on these 5 crucial battles, moments when history itself seemed to hold its breath. From the naive picnickers watching First Bull Run in horror as their summer entertainment turned into a rout, to the final desperate days in Atlanta that would seal Lincoln's re-election, these battles weren't just military engagements. They were pivot points where individual decisions, quirks of weather, and even simple twists of fate would reshape the American experiment. This is not just a story of generals moving pieces on a board. This is the tale of the Massachusetts professor who found himself defending Little Round Top with nothing but bayonets and raw courage. Of the Richmond socialite who watched from her window as the capital she loved became the capital of a rebellion. Of the Wisconsin farm boy who picked up a fallen flag at Antietam and carried it through a storm of bullets, never knowing his actions would inspire a president to transform the very nature of the war itself. 5 battles. 5 days that saved America. This is their story. The wake-up call, First Battle of Bull Run. Washington buzzed with anticipation that sweltering July morning in 1861. Congressmen and their wives packed elaborate picnic baskets, while reporters checked their notebooks and straightened their bow ties. They were headed to what promised to be the greatest spectacle of their lives. The day the Union Army would crush this upstart rebellion in a single decisive battle. If only someone had told the Confederates. Irvin McDowell, the Union commander, knew better. This army is not a mobile machine, he had warned Lincoln just days before. It's green as grass. But Lincoln needed a victory, and the public demanded action. The headline screamed, "On to Richmond!" And McDowell found himself pushing 30,000 untrained men toward Manassas Junction, where 2 critical railroads met in the Virginia countryside. The battle began promisingly enough. Union troops crossed Bull Run at dawn, launching a surprise flanking maneuver that sent the Confederate left reeling. By noon, jubilant spectators on Henry House Hill were popping champagne corks. Victory seemed assured. Then arrived Thomas Jonathan Jackson. "Look!" shouted General Barnard Bee to his retreating men, pointing to Jackson's Virginia brigade standing firm amid the chaos. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The nickname stuck, but more importantly, so did Jackson's men. Their stubborn defense bought time for Confederate reinforcements to arrive by rail, the first time in history trains would determine the outcome of a battle. What happened next defied every Northern expectation. Fresh Confederate troops struck the Union right like a thunderbolt. The professional corps of McDowell's army held briefly, but their amateur comrades began to waver. Then break. Then run. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers threw away their weapons and fled north. The fancy carriages of Washington society clogged the roads, their former occupants now running alongside their picnic baskets. Confederate artillery found the range. A shell struck a wagon, overturning it, creating a massive traffic jam. Panic spread like wildfire. One young officer, William Tecumseh Sherman, found himself struggling against the human tide of retreat. "We had whipped them at every point," he would later write, "but we didn't know it, and they didn't know it. And when both sides get scared, the one that runs first wins." By nightfall, the Union Army had dissolved into a mass of frightened men stumbling through the rain toward Washington. The Confederates, themselves too disorganized to pursue, were left in possession of the field, and a dangerous notion that the war might be easy. It would be the last time either side harbored such illusions. In the White House, Lincoln received the news with characteristic gravity. When his cabinet gathered the next morning, they found him transformed. Gone was the hesitant peace seeker of Fort Sumter. In his place sat a commander-in-chief who now understood the true scope of his task. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "this will be a long war." The turning point, Antietam and its aftermath. Robert E. Lee's worn cavalry boots rested atop a Maryland fence rail as he unfolded the morning newspaper. A rare smile crossed his weathered face. The headlines screamed of panic in Philadelphia, chaos in Baltimore, and calls in Washington for negotiated peace. His audacious invasion of the North was working perfectly. Then a Union corporal found the cigars. Wrapped around 3 fine Havana cigars was Special Order 191, Lee's detailed battle plans. Within hours, they lay on George McClellan's desk. "Now I know what to do," the Union commander exclaimed. "If I can't whip Bobby Lee with this, I will be willing to go home." Dawn broke crisp and clear on September 17, 1862. The cornfield north of Sharpsburg stirred with an early morning mist. David Miller, the farmer who owned the field, could never have imagined that by sunset his 30 acres of ripening corn would drink the blood of 10,000 men. The first Union attack struck like a sledgehammer. Joe Hooker's men emerged from the North Woods, their bayonets gleaming. The Confederate line erupted in flame. Men fell like wheat before a scythe. One Louisiana regiment lost 60% of its men in the first 5 minutes. The survivors watched in horror as the blue wave kept coming. "It was not war," one officer wrote later, "it was murder." In the center, the sunken road became a death trap. What began as a natural wagon path would end the day as Bloody Lane, filled level with fallen soldiers. Confederate troops stacked their dead comrades like sandbags until Union artillery found the range. The road transformed into a slaughterhouse. But it was at Burnside Bridge where fate played its cruelest trick. For 3 hours, Union General Ambrose Burnside hurled his men at a narrow stone bridge held by just 400 Georgia sharpshooters. Wave after wave of blue-clad soldiers fell into the creek. Only after discovering an unguarded ford did Burnside finally cross, just in time to meet A.P. Hill's division, arriving from Harper's Ferry in a forced march that would become legendary. Night fell on America's bloodiest day. 23,000 men lay dead or wounded. The corn in Miller's field had been trampled flat, the stalks so dark with blood they appeared black in the moonlight. Lee's invasion had been stopped, but McClellan's hesitation allowed the Confederate Army to slip away across the Potomac. Yet Antietam's impact would reach far beyond its tactical stalemate. In the White House, Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for a victory, any victory, to transform the war's purpose. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. With a stroke of his pen, he elevated the struggle from a war for union to a crusade for human freedom. The cigars that changed history. They were never smoked. The Union corporal kept them as souvenirs, unaware that his discovery had altered not just the outcome of a battle, but the very soul of the nation. The Battle of Gettysburg, a turning point in history. No one planned to fight at Gettysburg. The armies collided there by accident, drawn like magnets to the hub where 10 roads converged. Confederate General Henry Heth thought he'd spotted a cache of shoes in the small Pennsylvania town. Instead, he found Union cavalry, and history changed forever. The morning of July 1st erupted in confused combat west of town. Union General John Reynolds, one of the Army's finest commanders, had just enough time to deploy his men before a Confederate bullet found his skull. By afternoon, blue-clad soldiers retreated through Gettysburg streets, but they weren't running. They were racing for the high ground. Geography would determine destiny. While Confederate forces celebrated their first-day victory, Union troops fortified a fishhook-shaped line of hills south of town. The most junior officer present, a quiet professor named Joshua Chamberlain, found himself and his 20th Maine Regiment at the very end of the Union Army, holding a small hill called Little Round Top. "Hold at all costs," came the order. No one mentioned the ammunition was running low. When the Confederate assault came, it hit like a tidal wave. 15,000 of Longstreet's veterans struck the Union left, seeking to roll up the entire Federal line. At Little Round Top, Chamberlain's men fired until their rifles burned their hands. When the ammunition finally ran out, he made an impossible decision. "Bayonets!" he shouted. The former professor led his men in a desperate downhill charge that swept the stunned Confederates from the field. But Robert E. Lee saw only opportunity. On July 3rd, he ordered General George Pickett to crack the Union center. "The enemy is there," he said, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to strike him." At 1 p.m., the largest artillery bombardment ever seen in North America began. For 2 hours, the hills echoed with the thunder of over 150 guns. Then came the moment that would be forever etched in American memory. 12,500 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods and began their mile-long march across open ground. Union Artillery Commander Henry Hunt had deliberately held his fire during the bombardment, saving ammunition for this moment. "Wait until they're in range," he ordered. At 300 yards, his guns opened up. Solid shot tore huge gaps in the Confederate lines. Still they came. General Lewis Armistead led the final surge, his hat raised high on his sword. He reached the stone wall, planted the Confederate flag, and died alongside most of his men. Pickett's charge failed, and with it died the Confederacy's best hope for victory. That evening, as bands played Yankee Doodle behind Union lines, Confederate survivors straggled back. "It's all my fault," Lee told them. But Pickett, when asked to rally his division, replied with bitter truth, "General Lee, I have no division." The armies would continue fighting for 2 more years, but after Gettysburg, everyone knew the ending had been written. The only question was how many more would die before the last page turned. Vicksburg, the siege that split the Confederacy. While Gettysburg dominated headlines, the true death blow to the Confederacy was being delivered 1,000 miles away on the bluffs above the Mississippi. Vicksburg, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, stood as the last link between rebel armies east and west. Ulysses Grant meant to tear it apart. After months of failed frontal assaults, Grant conceived a plan so audacious his own staff thought him mad. On a moonless April night, Union gunboats ran the Confederate batteries at full steam, their smokestacks wrapped in chains to muffle the clanking. "It was like watching a volcano erupt," wrote one witness, as over 500 Confederate guns lit up the night. But most boats made it through. Grant then executed the most brilliant maneuver of the war. He marched his army south along the western bank, crossed back east below Vicksburg, and drove inland, deliberately cutting himself off from all supplies. "When in doubt, move forward," he told his nervous officers. His army lived off the land, fighting 5 battles in 17 days, never losing once. By May 18th, Vicksburg found itself trapped. Inside the city, life turned surreal. With Confederate guns commanding the river and Union artillery pounding from the hills, civilians retreated to over 500 hand-dug caves in the yellow clay bluffs. "We are eating rats," wrote one lady in her diary, and calling them squirrels to make it sound better. The siege transformed into a duel between sappers. Union engineers dug tunnels under Confederate fortifications, packing them with explosives. The defenders dug counter-tunnels. Sometimes they could hear each other working through the soil. One massive explosion created a crater 40 feet deep, leading to 3 days of hand-to-hand combat in what soldiers called the Pit of Hell. The city's last hope lay with General Joseph Johnston, gathering an army to break the siege. But Johnston moved too cautiously. Inside Vicksburg, horses became steaks, leather became soup, and soldiers' rations dropped to 4 ounces of cornmeal per day. Men began deserting, not to the enemy but to surrender to hunger. On July 4th, 1863, one day after Gettysburg, white flags appeared above Vicksburg's battered walls. Grant's terms were characteristically simple: unconditional surrender. But his treatment of the defeated garrison revealed his growing statesmanship. Confederate soldiers received rations and were paroled rather than imprisoned. "I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly," he wrote. The Mississippi now flowed unvexed to the sea, as Lincoln proclaimed. The Confederacy lay split in two. In Washington, a new assessment of Grant circulated. Here at last was a general who could win the war. But in Georgia, another city still stood defiant. Atlanta beckoned, and with it, the fate of Lincoln's presidency itself. Atlanta, the turning point in the Civil War. By summer 1864, the war had grown unbearable. Grant's casualties mounted in Virginia while Sherman stalled outside Atlanta. Gold prices soared, desertion rates climbed, and Lincoln privately wrote, "I am going to be beaten, and unless some great change takes place, badly beaten." Then Joe Johnston blinked. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's defensive strategy, replaced him with the aggressive John Bell Hood. It was exactly what Sherman wanted. "Hood would assault me with a corporal's guard," he gleefully telegraphed Washington. "I prefer him to Johnston." Hood didn't disappoint. On July 22nd, he launched a massive attack against Sherman's left flank. The fighting erupted so suddenly that Major General James McPherson, Sherman's most trusted subordinate, rode straight into Confederate skirmishers. "Surrender!" they shouted. McPherson tipped his hat, wheeled his horse, and died in a hail of bullets. The battle transformed into a soldier's fight, units lost in the woods, commands confused by the terrain. At one point, Union troops found themselves firing north while Confederates shot south at the same enemy. Hood's men briefly seized Sherman's supply lines but couldn't hold them. By nightfall, Atlanta's defenders had suffered 8,000 casualties they couldn't afford. Inside Atlanta, the situation grew desperate. Sherman's artillery hurled shells into the city day and night. "The children no longer jump when they hear explosions," wrote one mother. "They just ask, was that one ours or theirs?" Bread riots erupted in the streets, while Hood's army slowly withered. Sherman, showing his genius for psychological warfare, began systematically destroying every railroad line into Atlanta. He would sever one, wait for Hood to repair it, then strike another. The noose tightened with mechanical precision. On September 1st, Hood evacuated the city, setting fire to his ammunition dumps. The explosions lit up the night sky like summer lightning. The next morning, Atlanta's mayor formally surrendered his city to Sherman's army. The timing proved miraculous. Just as northern newspapers filled with stories of Atlanta's capture, the Democratic Party nominated George McClellan on a platform calling the war a failure. The contradiction proved fatal to Lincoln's opponents. His re-election, and with it the war's outcome, was secured. Sherman surveyed the captured city from the roof of the Atlanta Hotel. In his mind, a new kind of warfare was taking shape, one that would target not just armies, but the entire economic system that supported them. He would soon write to Atlanta's citizens, "War is cruelty. You cannot refine it." 2 months later, he began his famous march to the sea, leaving Atlanta in flames behind him. The Confederacy would survive another 5 months, but its fate had been sealed in the Georgia summer. The fall of Atlanta had given the Union something even more powerful than a military victory. It had restored hope. Epilogue: 5 battles, 1 nation. History pivots on moments that seem small in the living but loom large in retrospect. A lost set of orders wrapped around cigars. A professor's desperate bayonet charge. A single shell arcing over Charleston Harbor. Each one a thread in the tapestry of American transformation. These 5 battles did more than determine military victory. They fundamentally reshaped the American soul. Bull Run shattered our innocence about war's true nature. Antietam gave Lincoln his moment to transform a war for union into a crusade for human freedom. Gettysburg proved that citizen soldiers could match and defeat the finest military professionals of their age. Vicksburg demonstrated that modern warfare would be won not just by courage, but by logistics, engineering, and grinding siege. Atlanta showed that victory required breaking not just armies, but the will of the people who supported them. The human cost staggers modern comprehension. More Americans died at Antietam than in the War of 1812, Mexican War, and Spanish-American War combined. A soldier who survived all 5 of these battles would have seen over 100,000 of his countrymen fall. The equivalent death toll today would fill every Major League Baseball stadium in America. Yet from this crucible emerged a different nation. The United States entered the war as a loose federation, where loyalty to state often trumped loyalty to nation. It emerged as a single country, proven in blood that it was, in Lincoln's words, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The battlefields themselves tell the story of reconciliation. Where Miller's cornfield once ran red with blood, wheat now grows golden in the Maryland sun. The caves of Vicksburg house museums rather than refugees. Atlanta rose from Sherman's ashes to become a symbol of the New South. At Gettysburg, Confederate and Union veterans met 50 years later and embraced on the very ground where they had tried to kill each other. But perhaps the most powerful legacy lies in the words of a Union soldier who survived all 5 battles. Asked years later what he thought about when he remembered the war, he replied, "I don't think about the glory or the cause much anymore. I think about the boy from Georgia who shared his water with me at Antietam before we tried to kill each other. I think about the Confederate who helped me bury my brother at Atlanta. I think about how we were all Americans even when we forgot it for a while." These 5 battles forged modern America in fire. Their echoes still resound in every debate about states' rights, federal power, and the meaning of citizenship. They remind us that our nation's greatest strength lies not in our unanimity, but in our ability to emerge stronger from our deepest divisions. The cost was terrible. The lesson, eternal.